to mid-90s 26-inch mountain bikes that have since been converted to drop bar examples of the same bikes. But more notably, both have gone through the elimination of the old antiquated 3x7 drivetrain in favor of some sort of 1x10 speed cassette setup, each utilizing the stock OEM wheel set that came with the bike, might I add. One of which was completed in a very by-the-book fashion, the other, not so much. And in this week's episode of Tinker Tuesday, I thought it would be fun, instead of just building something else, to actually go through the process of what it takes to get a 10-speed cassette of sorts onto an old 7-speed mountain bike wheel. First of all, let's start with the one that we did it right with. Now, for those of you who followed along the build, you already know. But for those of you who didn't, here is the quick rundown on what is going on here. It is a 42-tooth narrow-wide race-face chainring with an 11 through to 42 Shimano 10-speed cassette, all shifted through a 10-speed SRAM shifter to a 11-speed, 1-to-1 exact ratio, rear derailleur, a Rival 1 rear derailleur to be precise. Now, how did this all work? You might be asking if you've got an older 7-speed mountain bike that maybe you thought you could grab this cassette and just slap it on there. Learning, of course, that it is not going to fit. The last cog and the lock ring will come nowhere near the thread. It doesn't seem like the Freehub body is long enough. This, by the way, if you don't know, is the Freehub body. Now, to avoid completely beating around the bush and making this longer than it needs to be, this on all hubs is swappable. It is a replaceable part on a hub. So if you're keen on keeping your original wheel set on your old, cool 26-inch mountain bike and you want to throw a 10-speed setup on it, the by-the-book hack is just to swap an 8, 9, 10-speed Freehub body onto the current hub that you have already. The process is actually not at all that difficult. I don't really have a wheel that I need to swap because I'm not going to do anything to Jeff's right now, but I will show you how a Freehub body comes off and goes back on. Now, this is the exact same kind of Tiagra hub that I pulled the Freehub body that is now on the rock hopper off of. This one I would love to use, but you can hear what kind of rough shape this is in. The process remains the same, even though it's sort of a junky Freehub body. So I would say this is probably the part that freaks people out the most, is pulling an entire hub apart, but it's way more archaic and simple than you think. So 15 millimeter cone wrench, 17 mil regular wrench, pull them apart. What I like to do is just stack whatever it is that you get together so you know what order they go back together. Bearings are in good shape, cones are in pretty good shape. Now this is where you do need to be careful. You don't need to be like overly careful. Don't be afraid, but just be conscious of the fact that there are loose ball bearings in there, and you can't just like pull it apart willy-nilly, because you will lose the amount of bearings that you're supposed to have, or when you find them, you'll have to clean them off really well. Axle out. Axle out. See this side. This side is in way worse shape.
There's only one man clever enough to have perpetrated such a dastardly crime. And I thought you were ready to give up.
Okay, all ball bearings accounted for. Obviously, the drive side, way grosser than the non-drive side. The drive side has lived a hard life. But now you've got a hub that is ready to have a Freehub body removed. 10mm alloy. In there is basically a fastener that is now attached to. And it is literally, at this point, the exact same process as just putting a fixed gear cog on. There. There's your Freehub body. Off. For those of you who are extra curious about how this works, this is basically just a big bolt that goes through the Freehub body this way. Just like this. But I can hear the question right now, what about spacing and like having to redish the wheel if you're throwing on a wider Freehub body? And it's a good question, but if you are sticking with the same width that the bike already was, and you're not cold setting the rear triangle and respacing the hub at all, you shouldn't have to do anything. This, on this bike here, was literally toss the Freehub body on, take everything from the original axle, screw it back together, call it a day. No respacing, no redishing. With the new wider Hyperglide, that's this Freehub body, versus the old Uniglide Freehub body, the bearing spots were exactly the same. The cones landed at the exact same spot. There was no change in the way that the hub spacing was set up. Let me show you. So with the old Uniglide Freehub body, like this, the spacer and cone nut sat out kind of like this. This is the axle. And with the new Hyperglide Freehub body installed, tons of space for a cassette to get on, lots of room here to not run into the frame, and plenty of space to put the quick release in without any interference in this entire area. So I'm going to assume, even though I don't have any real measurements in front of me, the bearings land in all Freehub bodies at about the same spot right there.
Winds southerly at about
See?
5 miles an hour.
Lots of space.
Pressure 30.00 and is rising. And no precipitation or
No interference. Okay, now that that's all out of the way, let's discuss the much lazier, much cheaper, and less involved way of putting a 10-speed cassette on a 7-speed Freehub body. Just literally drop one of the 10 cogs out of the cassette that you want to run on your 1x10 setup. Basically, all you need to do is drop one cog and one spacer, and it will fit in the space provided on your 7-speed Freehub body. Essentially, it just creates kind of like a weird 1x or maybe a 2x9 drivetrain. In a previous video, I had someone kind of wondering about whether or not you lose some of the indexing because of dropping the one cog. And as you can see from shifting through this, you don't lose any of the indexing that the cassette had. You took an equal amount out of the cassette and basically just brought it down into a 9-speed, 10-speed spaced drivetrain. Now, to combat the fact that you're down to 9 speeds instead of 10, you just lock out your last shift so that you can't shift the entire derailleur into the wheel. Honestly, this hack I think is kind of cooler because it allows you to go to a very modern drivetrain without having to do any of the like weird Freehub body swap work. Like, no anxiety about losing bearings, no anxiety about bearing preload, no anxiety about changing the spacing of your rear hub, whether you need to or not, just not having to think about it whatsoever. All you do with this setup and the way this is done is buy all your 10-speed stuff, pick which cog and spacer you want to remove that you feel you could live without, and install it. That is it. Lock out that last shift so you don't shift into the wheel. You're laughing. That was, I don't want this to finish on Jeff's bike, I want it to finish on mine. I hope that was at least somewhat informative, half entertaining. I realize that the bike nerdy stuff can get a little bit dry as it goes on, but if these kind of builds are something that you're considering, two cool things worth noting if you want to go for like a more modern 10-speed drivetrain. Two very, very simple, easy options that I don't think that any of you can't do on your own. Soon enough, probably this week, we will find out which of these two 26-inch drop bar 1x10 speed cassette conversion builds is the better final product. That one's not really done. It's going to be test one.